I would not have this budget on the floor if we had not set aside an amount in the rainy day fund that is at least equal to the projected deficit in the Medicaid. Had we had no rainy day fund, I could not, in good conscience, brought a budget that deliberately or optimistically assumes that the funding level in Medicaid is going to be much lower than what most people believe. And the only reason, in my opinion, that that's a responsible thing to do is because we will have more than that much money set aside in the rainy day fund in case we need it.
How much?
And to add to that is the thing that I was worried about the most, and I've talked about this in the press, is I think because we only spent a limited amount of the rainy day fund, and there will be at least $6 billion set aside for issues like you're talking about, as long as we didn't create another hole in public school finance, and I think that with recent agreements we will not, we'll be fine.
In this budget, do you know, and I know we're going to talk about 1811, I guess, tomorrow, the fiscal matters bill. How much of the fiscal matters bill, first of all, how much did that come to in total between the two?
I don't know the exact number, but when you count the deferral, in order for this thing to balance, it's going to have to be in the neighborhood, counting the deferral, of $3.5 billion.
Okay, so the deferral makes up about $2.3 billion of that, so about $1.2 billion. And do you know, of that 1.2, how much of that is one-time funding sources versus recurring sources?
I don't know.
Some amount.
Some of it would probably be one time, and I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll ask Senator Duncan that when he brings that bill forward tomorrow. How much in the way of dedicated fund balances are being used to balance the budget at this time?
I don't know the answer, but it's going to be several $billion. Exactly what, I don't know. I think it's between 1.8 and 2, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
I'm sure they can send me a note while you're asking me and tell me.
Okay. And then you said, as you were laying the bill out a moment ago, or the conference committee report on the bill, that we would be borrowing or authorizing the issuance of debt of about $4.1 billion for our transportation improvements.
That's correct.
Okay. Based on all of that, if you look at the $2.3 billion deferral, what may or may not be a risk on the $800 million property valuation increase that was included here, the $4.8 billion in Medicaid funds, the dedicated fund balance that was used, which it looks like maybe you have the number there.
The number I was given based on your question is $4.5 billion.
Okay, so $4.5 billion in dedicated fund balances that were used to balance the budget. A certain amount of one-time fees, don't know exactly what that number is, somewhere included within that $1.2 billion that's in SB 1811. And then the $4.1 billion issuance of debt for transportation. The concern that I have is that we are pushing forward a problem that we're going to have to address at some point. And if the economy doesn't improve dramatically, I'm concerned with what this legislature will face the next time, because we didn't really do anything to address revenue sources that will help us correct a downturn in the economy and a response to it. And you've done, I think, a very creative job in terms of finding your way through a difficult crisis and a lot of different solutions were brought to the table in order to get us to the balanced budget that you're bringing forward today. But some of it is pushing off to that next budget cycle, many billions of dollars actually. And my concern that is that without an improvement in the economic picture, a dramatic one, we're going to wind up facing a structural deficit again. It may not be the result of education funding anymore, because that's permanently now taken $4 billion off the state's balance sheet in terms of our obligation for public ed. But through all of these other tools, I fear that we are going to start next session with a structural deficit in place that we're going to have to face. Do you have any thoughts on what that number might be?
No, and I wouldn't want to speculate on it. But if nothing changes, well, I will speculate. If nothing changes, based on the way you outlined the question, less than $5 billion is what I believe the potential quote biennial shortfall could be less than $5 billion. And once again, I'm relying on the fact that there'll be over $6 billion in the rainy day fund to cover what I believe is potentially maybe a $5 billion shortfall in the various different entitlement programs that we have in the bill. So
it may be up to about a $10 billion structural deficit, but we'll use $5 to $6 billion of rainy day money to cover part of that.
I'm not talking about the structural deficit. I'm just talking about the similar situation that we had coming into this session when the comptroller said we were $4.1 billion short, and we ended up being like $3.9 billion short in the current biennium. What I'm saying to you, in my opinion, we will not be short by more than $5 billion under the most pessimistic scenario that I'm aware of.
But that would include us using some of these same mechanisms again into the next fiscal cycle, if that's the case.
A couple of things I'd like to articulate, because I mean, you outline a problem, and I can articulate that problem too. In fact, I've tried. In fact, for the last 6 months I've been trying. For the last year I've been trying. But revenue bills have to originate in the House. So that really limits our options. And I think when you're writing a budget as difficult as this, you've got to weigh this potential risk with the reality of cutting the budget even more. And so without the ability to raise additional revenues, which the people of the state of Texas have clearly said they don't want us to do anyway, but we don't even have the ability even if they did want us to do it, then you've got to make a decision on what is a appropriate cut and what is a draconian cut, and should we be optimistic about the future of Texas or pessimistic? I believe this budget makes appropriate reductions. I also believe it's optimistic about the future, and based on our history, that's probably a pretty safe assumption.
Thank you, Senator Ogden.